Today, the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston brings you a conversation with one of our most popular and interesting speakers, recognized as Putin's most wanted man, human rights leader, Mr. Bill Browder. My name is Marianne Maldonado, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, a bipartisan nonprofit organization focused on the better understanding of world issues and how they affect our personal lives. Before we begin, I'd like to say a special hello to all of our members and students of the World Affairs Council of Houston. And if you're not a member and you're interested in learning more about world issues, you can find more information on our website at wachhouston.org. If you're a current member, thank you. I know you're proud to be part of Houston's premier organization for bipartisan understanding. We have some exciting new updates for our members that we'll be sharing with you soon. And again, if you're not a member and would like to be recognized as a council member here in Houston, visit our website or call our office for more information. We'd be glad to help you. If you would like to receive all of our online programs right in your inbox, be sure to hit the subscribe button below, and you'll automatically be notified when we post a program. Some upcoming speakers that we have arranged for you are Mr. Ben Hubbard. He is with the New York Times. He is the Beirut Bureau Chief, and he will be speaking on the rise of power of MBS. And we are also so excited to have a dialogue with Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations. So be sure to click the button and stay subscribed to this channel, stay engaged, and stay connected. The World Affairs Council of Greater Houston joins the many national and community leaders dedicated to fighting injustices that are a detriment to our health and well-being of everyone in America. And we stand firmly with those fighting for their lives every day. Today, our conversation, we continue in support of this initiative with Mr. Bill Browder. The author of the book, Red Notice, A Fight for Justice in Russia, Bill is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, which was the investment advisor to the largest foreign investment fund in Russia until 2005, when Bill was denied entry to the country and declared a threat to national security. Please welcome back to the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, Mr. Bill Browder. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you very much, Bill, again for joining us. And thank you again for the two wonderful events last year in Houston. I know our audience was delighted. Both events were sold out. I think we could have had many, many more people. Perhaps we will again down the line. It was a true pleasure and honor to host you. And for today's discussion, we'll discuss the book and some of what we talked about last year. Red Notice, by the way, a lot of you already have it, but if you don't, here are two versions of it, the older one and the newer one. It is truly a fascinating book about Bill's life. So we'll talk about the book, but also I want to spend a lot of time talking about what has happened basically since the book, where it concludes and the work that Bill, you've been doing in the years since. And for any of you who haven't read the book, I highly recommend it. In my 8+ years of the council, I've read some fascinating books and fascinating people, but it's truly one of the most interesting books. Bill's book reads somewhat like a novel because your life has been incredible. The first part of the book is almost like an adventure. The second part is realistically speaking, it's kind of like an action-packed thriller. It's so high-paced and what's going on. But ultimately, I think it's a story of a powerful transformation. And you go from being one of the most successful foreign investors in history and an incredibly accomplished businessman to becoming one of the world's most prominent, and I would say indeed, most effective and influential human rights advocates. So maybe we'll just start kind of where the crux of the book, where it makes the big turn. When Putin got elected, you and others in Russia, and even indeed in the West, the Bush administration, Republicans and Democrats, were optimistic about Putin, thinking it was a new leader, someone who could take over after Yeltsin's kind of troubling years, somebody they could work with. Can you talk about how initially in the book you describe how your interests with Putin aligned, this idea of kind of hopefully cleaning up corruption within the country, making businesses and the ways in which businesses would run themselves more effective. But the idea that maybe he saw you as a useful tool to help knock off oligarchs who weren't cooperative with him, but ultimately you ended up on the wrong side of them.
First of all, Ronan and Marianne and the World Affairs Council, thank you for hosting me. It's nice to be back. I have fond memories of my last time in Houston, and hope that we can do this in person, perhaps after I finish my next book. Anyway, it's great to be here today. So when Putin came into power, Putin really was not the president of Russia. He was president of the presidential administration of Russia. And what had happened was that the power, I'm going to get a different angle here so the light isn't shining. The power of the presidency had been stolen by these people called the Russian oligarchs. There were 22 individuals who had basically become immensely rich in Russia. And they were so rich that they could control arms of the government, they could control members of parliament. And because of that, when Putin first came in, and I should point out that while they were in that position, they were stripping all the assets out of the country for themselves, and the rest of the 150 million people in Russia were living in destitute poverty. And it really was the most unfair situation anywhere in the world, as far as so few people taking so much and everybody else suffering. And so when Putin first came in, he was pretty mad about these oligarchs because they were effectively more powerful than him. And I think everybody in Russia was pretty mad about all these oligarchs because they were taking everything. And so we were all hoping that there would be somebody to come and stop that. And Putin said, I'm going to come in and stop that. And he said he's going to come in and stop that, not because of the unfairness of the system. He said he's going to come in and stop that because he didn't want them taking his power. But for a period of time, so I was fighting the oligarchs. I was running the largest investment fund in the country, and I was fighting the oligarchs who were stealing from me. And Putin was fighting the oligarchs because they were stealing power from him. And so we had this weird alignment of interests, or at least in the early stages, an alignment of interests. Sorry about this noise here in London. We had this early stage alignment of interests where every time I would publicize the crimes of the oligarchs, Putin would come in and try to do something about it. And so that created a weird, I would say, short-term alliance with Putin, an alliance that it was never spoken. I never met him or had anything to do with him. But every time I would do something, he would come in and do something which would be helpful in my fights with these oligarchs. But that only lasted up to a point. And
just, I guess, to take people really to the highlight, which was a transformation in a lot of ways for foreign investors in Russia, but for you in particular, and maybe just a turning point in your whole life. By 2005, you're the largest foreign investor, managing over $4 billion in assets in a variety of companies all across Russia. But one of the ways you were able to attract investment from the West was your model was to look into Russian companies, try and bring them to a certain standard of accounting and transparency that made them more attractive and more easily kind of to understood and attractive to invest for foreign investors. But at the same time, in doing that and your due diligence for looking into companies, you obviously would find things that could be disturbing. And could you talk about the very tragic case of your attorney, Sergei?
So the story goes like this. So there's this period of time when we were exposing corruption in these Russian companies. You put it politely when you say, better accounting or whatever. We were trying to stop the stealing. And that worked well. It worked for a while Putin was fighting with the oligarchs. But then he arrested the richest oligarch in the country, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the owner of an oil company called Yukos, put him on trial, and allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia on trial sitting in a cage. And that had a profound effect on the oligarchs. They all went to him and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage? And Putin said 50% for himself. And he became the richest man in the world in 2004. And all of my activities became no longer acceptable. And after that, I was expelled from the country. My offices were raided. And I ended up hiring a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky to defend me. And he discovered that during the raid of my offices, that these corrupt officials had seized a bunch of our documents and used those documents to steal $230 million of taxes that we had paid to the Russian government from the Russian government. So they weren't stealing our money. They were stealing from the Russian government taxes that we paid in the previous year. Sergei exposed this theft. He testified against the officials involved. And about 5 weeks after he testified against the same officials, those officials came to him, arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, where he was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony. He refused to withdraw his testimony. The torture got worse and worse. And on November 16th, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky was killed in Russian police custody after 358 days in detention at the age of 37, leaving a wife and 2 children.
And I suppose, as you note in the book, that was really a incredibly powerful moment in your life. You're someone who, for the most part, had an incredible career in business. It maybe kind of was a kind of opened up a calling within you. A lot of people, like you mentioned, a lot of the oligarchs, the ones who were probably smart enough to get out before Putin arrested them, they went to London or maybe France or other parts of the West. And they went on and lived a regular life. They had their money, they could do whatever, have a very comfortable, easygoing life. Obviously, you could have done the same thing. Besides the fact that it's a huge complication, there's obviously incredible personal risk. Plenty of people who got on the wrong side of Putin have, somehow had some unfortunate poisonings or fallen off of balconies or have otherwise met unfortunate ends. Can you talk about your work since the tragic death of Magnitsky to push through initially the Magnitsky Act in the United States? If maybe you could talk about what the Magnitsky Act does, and if we could talk about the initial work you did getting it through the U.S. Congress, especially with the strong support of legends like John McCain and others. Could you talk about the Magnitsky Act, how you formulated it, what it was intended to do, and then maybe we'll move forward from that.
So after Sergei's murder, it totally devastated me. It was the worst possible thing that could have ever happened as far as I was concerned. He was, and it was sort of my responsibility. He was my lawyer. They killed him because he was my lawyer. They killed him as my proxy. And if he hadn't been working for me, he'd still be alive today. So I made a vow to myself, to his memory, and to his family that I was going to go and put aside everything else I was doing and use all of my time, all of my resources, and all of my energy to go after the people who killed him, make sure they face justice. And that for the last 10 years, that's what I've been doing. And at first I tried to get justice in Russia, but the Russian authorities circled the wagons. Vladimir Putin got involved personally in exonerating the officials who played a role in his torture and murder. They gave promotions and state honors to some of the people who were most complicit. And so it became obvious to me that if we're going to get any justice, we're going to have to do it outside of Russia. And then I said to myself, well, how do we get justice outside of Russia for a murder that was committed in Russia? And I came up with an idea, which was that the people who killed him, they killed him for $230 million. And they don't keep that money in Russia because as easily as they stole it, it could be stolen from them. They keep it in the West. They go shopping in the West, buy houses in the West, send their kids to school in the West. They do everything in the West. And so I came up with this idea, which was we may not be able to get them for torture or murder, but we could certainly seize their assets, freeze their assets, and ban their visas. And so I went to Washington and I met Senator John McCain and Senator Benjamin Cardin, a Republican and Democrat, and I told them the story of what happened to Sergei. And I said, can we ban their visas and freeze their assets? And these two senators said yes. And that became known as the Magnitsky Act. And it started with just Sergei Magnitsky. and then they realized very quickly that they had sort of accidentally stumbled upon something much bigger than one case, but a technology for dealing with all the bad stuff going on in Russia. And they applied it not just to the Magnitsky case, but to all human rights abusers in Russia. And it passed the Senate 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives 89%. And it became a federal law on December 14th, 2012. And Vladimir Putin went out of his mind when this law was passed. For him, it was the worst thing that could have ever happened, because he's a guy who's ready to kill for money. And all of a sudden, his money and the money of all of his comrades is at risk of being frozen. And he made it his so he in retaliation, he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. And then he made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And some of you may remember on June 9th, 2016, a Russian lawyer named Natalia Veselnitskaya visited Trump Tower to meet with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort. This is before Donald Trump was elected. And she was there with dangling the carrot of dirt on Hillary Clinton. And in exchange, on behalf of Vladimir Putin, she said that if Donald Trump was elected, they would like the Magnitsky Act to be repealed. Now, thankfully, that hasn't happened. There was no repeal of the Magnitsky Act, and nor will there be. And better than that, at the end of 2016, the same senators sponsored and passed the global Magnitsky Act, which takes the Magnitsky legislation and applies it to bad guys everywhere in China and Venezuela and Iran and so on. And I'm also happy to say that the Magnitsky Act has gone to other countries. After the United States, Estonia passed a Magnitsky Act, Canada passed a Magnitsky Act, Britain passed a Magnitsky Act, Latvia, Lithuania, Kosovo, and we now have the EU and Australia on deck for Magnitsky Acts. And it's effectively become the best tool for dealing with bad actors in the world, because we're living in a world where, in a globalized world where people travel, where people keep their money, where and most of these human rights abuses are connected to corruption, and so when they can't get access to their money, that is a real nasty sanction. And better than that is not just the people who are sanctioned, but the people who are afraid of being sanctioned. And so for every one person who's been sanctioned, there's 1,000 or 10,000 that are afraid that, they might be sanctioned. And so we've kind of leveled the playing field a little bit in terms of good and evil. And all that has been done in the name of Sergei Magnitsky. And it really is a true legacy for him and his family, that his death wasn't a meaningless death, and that hopefully his sacrifice will save tens of thousands of lives in the future.
And thank you again. I mean, obviously, as people might assume, you I'm sure just must deal with kind of an underlying pervading degree of uncertainty or stress of being such a prominent critic of Putin. But your work with the Magnitsky Act, you mentioned, starting in the United States and then moving across the world, is done incredible things in terms of trying to address human rights violators all around the world. And maybe just so people understand, like you've told me and you've told many other people, this is not about targeting Vladimir Putin. This is not about regime change in Russia. I think, as you've said, and many others would say, that's quite unlikely. There's more than likely, one way or the other, unless something dramatic happens, he'll be in power, or at least somehow pulling the strings, probably maybe until the end of his life. But can you talk about what it is about, is more broadly, is stopping that kind of model or method of kind of criminality and governance spreading from there outside to other countries?
Yeah, so I don't believe that it's really our place to try to get rid of Putin. It's for the Russian people to get rid of Putin if they want to get rid of him. And he is a menace, and he's evil, and it's all documented, and there's no mystery about that. And that's their job, to get rid of him. But it's our job in the West not to allow him to export his criminality, his assassinations, his corruption, his money laundering, his malfeasance. And so we can close it down for him in the West, and that's effectively what this is. And for him, it's really a problem because all that money that they're stealing in Russia, they want to spend it in the West. They want to keep it safe in the West, and they can't. And that is a problem. And it only works if we get all good countries on board. You know, if we don't have the EU on board and they can't keep their money in America and the UK, but they can keep it in France, then they're not so adversely affected. But if we get the EU, which is one of my big targets, it's a total game changer.
And maybe just help people understand, I don't want to get into the technicalities of it, but how is it specifically that the transferring of money, or hopefully the transparency of money being moved, has changed with Magnitsky Act? Maybe you could talk about very basically how it is, say, previously, you know, an oligarch in one part of the world might have moved money to a safer bank in the West, and how it's been made a lot more complicated.
Well, so what happens is if somebody gets put on the Magnitsky Act, put on the Magnitsky list in the United States, for example, they get put on something called the U.S. Treasury OFAC sanctions list. This is a list that the U.S. Treasury keeps of sanctioned individuals. And the U.S. Treasury is very tough about this list. And if you are a bank or a business and you have any kind of presence in America and you do business with anybody on the OFAC sanctions list, you get fined 3 times the amount of business that you did. So let's just take a bank, for example. So let's just say an oligarch has $100 million in not even an American bank, in a Swiss bank. But that Swiss bank has got operations in dollars and they do things in America. And all of a sudden a person gets put on the Magnitsky list. That oligarch gets put on the Magnitsky list. And he decides he wants to transfer the money out of the Swiss bank. If the Swiss bank does the transfer, they're liable for $300 million of fines to the US Treasury. And how much money do they make on that transfer? Like $150. So the upside is $150. The downside is $300 million. And so even though that person has not been sanctioned in Switzerland, they've been sanctioned in the United States, because the US is so powerful, the Swiss bank will effectively freeze their money. At the same time, the Swiss bank has got a problem with the Russian oligarch because he's saying, you're not under any legal obligation to freeze my money. You're in Switzerland. I'm going to sue you because I want the money for damages. And so all of a sudden, the bank is damned if they do and damned if they don't. If they move the money, they're in trouble with the Treasury. If they don't move the money, they're legally in trouble with the oligarch. So what does the head of the bank do? Well, he gathers up all of his account officers and says, okay, we've got this one guy who's been sanctioned. Is there any more people on this list that are doing bad, any more people in our bank that are doing bad things that might be sanctioned in the future? And I want them all fired from the bank as clients as soon as possible. And so what the Magnitsky Act has done is it hasn't just sanctioned the individuals, but it's created this new set of incentives for all businesses. And these are businesses that are totally amoral. I mean, this Swiss bank, and I'm actually thinking this is a real example. I'm not going to say the name, but they were like, running around the world, desperately whining and dining these oligarchs, hoping to get their business. And now all of a sudden the oligarchs are persona non grata because they don't want to get their bank into deep trouble. And that's a pretty good thing, I think. So we've created a sort of toxic environment for being a human rights violator, for being an oligarch. And it's not just for Russians, it's for people all over the world. And so the great thing about the Magnitsky Act is that it doesn't target countries, it targets individuals. And so we can go after Russian bad guys, and the United States government at the same time can have diplomatic relations with the foreign minister of Russia. You can buy and sell goods in and out of Russia, and you can sanction individuals at the same time. And it makes it much easier to do the sanctions, but because it doesn't sort of just derail everything else that's going on. And that was always the excuse for why governments didn't want to do anything, is they're saying, well, what are we supposed to do? We need to do diplomacy and we need to do trade with that country. Well, you can do both, and you can express your displeasure about their individuals who are torturing and killing people.
And maybe just to address maybe some of the issues that make it much more complicated with kind of wider and broader scope for the Magnitsky Act. Obviously, we talked about the United States. You mentioned places like Australia, Estonia, UK. And, last year, I think in December, there was an agreement in principle for the European Union to have a version of the Magnitsky Act, but it's delayed implementation for 2020. But is part of the issue that makes it very difficult for Europe, especially say Central Europe and Eastern Europe, that as massive as the United States economy is, Russia is a large country, not necessarily a huge economy, but the volume of trade between the countries is tiny. The US total exports to Russia is about 1/2 of our total exports and about 1/2 of our total imports. But when you come to Europe, it's an enormously different situation, especially when the Russians have the threat of freezing them out and turning off the gas with all the gas pipelines running in from Europe, Russia into Eastern Europe and beyond. How much harder is it to get the Europeans to get on board, say the Germans or others that have huge amounts of economic ties with the Russians as opposed to Americans?
Well, it's been very hard to get the Europeans on board. And the hardest part of that is not actually the trade. I mean, the trade is important, but remember, we're not talking about cutting off trade here. We're saying we're just going to sanction a few of your individuals. The hardest part is that in the European Union, in order to do foreign policy, every member of the European Union has to agree to do anything. And so there used to be 28 member states, now there's 27. And every single country has to unanimously agree to do it. And so Putin has his Trojan horses in the EU. There's this Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, who is like, right in Putin's pocket. And so Hungary, for example, up until December of last year was vetoing the EU Magnitsky Act because this was Putin's way of doing that. And he's got all sorts of levers he can pull with these little countries that nobody even pays attention to. But because of this unanimity requirement, he can cause trouble. And so it's a very complicated exercise in Europe. And even once we get the law passed, to get people on the list, every country has to agree. And so it's a difficult situation. And it's a major sort of structural failing of the European Union to have this type of system.
And I realize, that the Magnitsky Act is targeting specific individuals as opposed to pure trade. But at the end of the day, if the oligarchs get unhappy enough with it and they go to Putin and say, we're being punished too much from this Magnitsky Act, you need to punish the Europeans or slow down gas or something like that. Isn't there the potential that Europeans worry about how it's going to impact their economies that way?
Yeah, well, they're terrified of that, and so on one hand, you have them terrified of that, and scared to death of being blackmailed by the Russians. And the Russians have used gas as a political weapon in the past. They cut off the gas before on more than one occasion. And then at the same time as you have that, Germany, together with Russia, is building a new pipeline to bypass Ukraine and the Baltics to become more dependent on Russian gas. I mean, where's the logic? And the U.S. has taken a tougher stand on this, and basically has threatened to apply sanctions. They've already sanctioned this pipeline. They threatened to apply sanctions to anyone helping build the pipeline, and so the Europeans have all had to back off. But it's almost built. And I just scratch my head and thinking, why are the Americans protecting Europe from themselves? I mean, so they become more dependent on Russia? It makes no sense.
Yeah, obviously very complicated. And maybe just to turn to things that have been in the news related to Russia and you specifically since we last saw you last year. Maybe could you, it's maybe initially talk about something that people might have seen in January. You were at Davos. There was the unusual case of two plumbers being stopped in Switzerland, two plumbers who happened to have diplomatic passports, which is obviously quite unusual. Some people thought maybe they were to surveil you or other people, but also obviously an inherent threat. The people who tried to poison Skripal in England, they came in under various guys as well. But perhaps the sadder and kind of worst story to come out of Switzerland in the last few months, and maybe you could talk about more of the details, is that Switzerland now has agreed to cooperate with Putin and Russia's investigation of the Magnitsky documents and testimony, and that even worse than that, that the federal prosecutor's office has seemed to be possibly, in essence, in bed with Putin, doing trips to Russia and all this sort of stuff. And it's created a huge degree of turmoil in Switzerland, where people might expect, obviously banking practices have been complicated and shades of gray for a long time, but people might have thought when it came to governments and politics that Switzerland would be a straightforward country. Can you talk about the unfortunate realities right now going on in Switzerland?
It's crazy over there. So let me start with the plumber story and then work our way through. So every year for the last 20 or so years, I go to this World Economic Forum in Davos. It's a great gathering of heads of state and captain of industry and various people. And I go there with a specific agenda of telling everyone, don't invest in Russia. And the Russians hate me for it. They absolutely hate me for it. And I show up at this business jamboree, and it's the one place where when the Russian deputy prime minister is speaking, I can be in the room and I can raise my hand and I can completely ruin his pitch. And so I was packing my bags, about to go this year in January, and I get a call from an organization in the UK called SO15. SO15 is the unit of the British police. It's called the anti-terrorist unit of the British police that protect people from terrorist threats. And I know these people because I'm one of the people that's under threat. And the officer said, we've just received a message from our counterparts in Switzerland that they know you're coming to Davos, and that they believe that there's a threat to your life. And they want to discuss how to minimize that threat. And so I'm on my way into Davos, and then I get a call from a journalist that I know, and he fills me in. And it turns out that the two individuals were hanging around Davos that nobody, and Davos is a small town that nobody, everybody knows everybody, and everyone noticed these two people were out of place. And so somebody reported it to the local police, and the local police then went to these two individuals and said, who are you? And they said, we're just here on vacation. What do you do? We're plumbers. Can we see some ID? And then they pull out diplomatic passports.
Very good
and
plumbers.
say, we'd like to go now. And apparently this was some type of operation which had been organized, which I guess had been scuppered by the fact that these people are so obvious. But that's what the Swiss police were warning me about. And so that was the first Swiss ordeal I had. but the next ordeal, and this is more shocking than that, is that we had also identified proceeds from the crime that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over going to Switzerland, about $20 million. And we filed a criminal complaint a long time ago, 2011. And the Swiss authorities froze the $20 million at Credit Suisse and UBS. An investigation was launched. And it was really going very aggressively for the first 2 years. And then the prosecutor who was prosecuting the case left the prosecutor's office, and a new team came in. And all of a sudden, everything ground to a halt. It completely ground to a halt. They stopped investigating. They stopped cooperating with other countries. They refused to indict any of the people whose money had been frozen. And we couldn't understand why. It just seemed so strange. And it was like a true, mystery. And then all of a sudden, we learned last year that the lead Russian specialist on this team from the Swiss Federal Police, who had been seconded to the prosecutor's office, had been found out and caught taking bribes from the Russians. So he was fired from the police and prosecuted and found guilty for taking bribes. And so we would have thought, well, wow, okay, we've rooted it out. The nastiness is rooted out, and we can now get on with business. And then after that, and this is the most amazing thing, the Russian government, who has been after me now since the Magnitsky Act was passed, since 2012, they've been trying to arrest me. I've got criminal cases going on. They have multiple criminal cases. I've already been convicted twice in absentia, sentenced to 18 years in prison in Russia. The Russians then applied to the Swiss for mutual legal assistance in another prosecution of me. And the Swiss, who refused to prosecute the money launderers from Russia, have immediately agreed to cooperate with the Russians. And so the only conclusion I can draw from this is that the country is completely bent. It's like, you'd think of Switzerland as being a kind of a legit place, but it's a banana republic when it comes to Russia. And the general prosecutor of the country now is being impeached by their parliament, not on our case, although that soon to be our case will be part of the impeachment, but on the World Cup case, on the case where Russia and Qatar were illegitimately granted the World Cup, and they found out bribery was taking place to do that. And the organization that organizes the World Cup is FIFA, located in Switzerland, and they were supposed to prosecute the people from FIFA, and it turns out that the prosecutor was just like also having inappropriate relations with them. And so it's a twisted story and a bad country, and and I never thought that I would see Swiss prosecutors taking bribes from the Russians to stop investigations.
No, and I suppose a sad reminder that even in the countries we might assume or have some of the kind of more transparent or effective forms of government in the West or other places, that corruption and bribery can exist sadly anywhere, and that's a lot of what your Magnitsky Act is trying to address, well beyond just Russia. Yep. Maybe another thing people might have noticed about you in the news lately is the relatively recently released Russia report in the UK. Can you tell people what that was? I know you testified to British intelligence in different manners. I know you can't maybe talk specifically about everything you said, but can you tell what the report was about and what it found, and perhaps more unfortunately, what happened with regards to people trying to prevent its release?
So this was a report that was being commissioned by the Intelligence and Security Committee of the British Parliament. And the report's mandate was to examine Russian interference in British politics. Similar is a parallel situation to what had happened in the United States. And they came to me because we had a lot of evidence of Russian oligarchs being deputized by the government to get intelligence and to affect policy in the UK. And those Russian oligarchs then paid British citizens to assist them in this process. And we had come across documentary evidence of this through emails that leaked and various other sources. And so I submitted this evidence as part of the report. And the report was supposed to be published at the end of last year. And just as the report was going to come out, they held it back. And it has not come out. And everybody, and I don't know what else was in the report other than what I submitted, but the fact that there was this damning report on Russian interference in British politics that's been frozen by the British government is quite an extraordinary story in itself. And so I and all the other contributors to the report want to see this made public. And so far, we're now, I think, 8 months delayed, and there's no sign that it's ever going to be published.
And just out of curiosity, what's Boris Johnson's position on it being released?
Boris Johnson said it will be released. I mean, it's not really his job to release it. It's the job of the. So what happened was Parliament it's the parliamentary committee that releases it. After Parliament was disbanded, the government then said, well, we have no parliamentary committee, so we're not going to release it. There's a new parliament now. There's a new Intelligence and Security Committee, and they haven't released it. So we'll see.
And maybe just, I'll turn to the audience questions now. Just maybe combine sometimes some questions that are similar, but Peter asks, how are candidates for the OFAC sanctions determined? How is evidence gathered, and who determines this? And then related to that, someone else asks, is there potential for abuse by the Magnitsky Act, i.e. if somebody who shouldn't be on the list is put on it by somebody who's abusing their power?
So the way that you get onto the Magnitsky list, or the way that it's determined, is by the U.S. Treasury. The Treasury puts together what they call a sanctions package, and it requires evidence in strong enough form so that if there ever is a challenge, because it is challengeable, they could go to court and say, this person has done these atrocities. These atrocities are covered under the Magnitsky Act, and here's the evidence to prove it. And so it's not easy to get people on the list, and I've been trying for years to get people on the list, and I would say of the nearly 300 people that I've proposed evidence for, 50 of them have got on the list, which is a huge number. There's 50 on the Russian list, and there's 191 on the global list, and so it's not a very long list yet. I hope it becomes longer. And there are judicial protections. If your money is frozen, they can't arbitrarily freeze your money without you having the ability to challenge them on that. And there is the ability for a bad government to abuse the Magnitsky Act. And let me just share with you a story. It's not about the Magnitsky Act, but it's about another situation. Recently, the International Criminal Court in The Hague has begun a pre-investigation stage review of whether there was torture going on in black sites in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places by the U.S. Authorities. The U.S. doesn't like that. And so there was an executive order that was just signed by President Trump, which applies sanctions to judges of the International Criminal Court to sanction them and their family members for investigating the United States. Now, I can understand why they might not want to investigate the United States, and I understand that perhaps it's some rogue regime that's initiated this case, but to sanction judges from the International Criminal Court using the same tools you use on Magnitsky kind of gives Magnitsky sanctions a bad name, and that is, in my mind, an abuse of this tool.
And I mean, so obviously, if that undercuts the legitimacy of it, or I guess, are you concerned that that could continue, or it could broaden to other judges or other people, kind of in essence doing human rights investigations?
Well, I guess it all depends on the evolution of U.S. politics and who's running the country and so on and so forth. It kind of feels to me more of an aberration than a trend, but it's not a good aberration.
And just here, you mentioned earlier the 50 or so Russians on the list, and then I think you said 100 and so others for other parts of the world. Related to that, other parts of the world, two questions. Maybe I'll just ask them together because they're similar. From Mary, who asked, has anyone in China been put on the list as a result of the treatment of the Uyghurs? And similar to that, James asks, the Trump administration has sanctioned Chinese officials with the global Magnitsky Act, in particular against the Communist Party secretary in charge of Xinjiang province. The issue is the treatment of the Uyghurs. Some say this is an effective step. Others in Congress say it is ineffective. What do you think about the application of the Magnitsky Act to the Chinese?
Well, so the first Chinese person that was sanctioned was a Beijing security official for killing a Chinese human rights lawyer in prison. And that happened a few years ago. But the Uyghur story is actually, in my mind, probably one of the biggest and most shocking human rights stories of our time. We all looked at the Holocaust, Nazi concentration camps, and said, never again. And here in our lifetime, right now, today, a religious minority in China is being put in concentration camps, and people are being killed and raped and abused, enslaved. And I think this is probably the single biggest human rights issue in the world right now. And I was glad to see the president sign the Uyghur Human Rights Act just a couple of days ago. And I'm glad to see that the Magnitsky Act is a tool, as one of the tools we're going to use in that. And I do believe it's effective. And I think that I've seen how effective the Magnitsky Act is. I've seen how much the Russians hate it. They spend so much time on it. We know it's effective. And the Chinese are probably equally stung by it and equally angry about it and equally unable to retaliate because it's not like US officials want to go on vacation in China or keep their money in Chinese banks. And so I think it's a good thing to do. And I'm friends with a number of Uyghur activists and they've been begging for world attention and begging for US policy, and they finally got something. And I think it's really a major breakthrough.
And, as you notice, the Uyghurs, we've done events on them as well. At a minimum, over 1 million have gone through the term the Chinese use themselves, re-education camps, which is kind of frightening. The camps are so large they can be seen easily with Google Maps. Are you concerned for yourself now that obviously you've stirred the hornet's nest with Putin and Russia, and now that you might be doing the same thing with President Xi in China?
Well, I mean, Putin and I have a special animus with one another. I think the Chinese are focused on, there's a lot of people higher, I'm Putin's #1 enemy. I'm sure that I don't even register. There's so many people that the Chinese are worried about. I'm fully supportive of all my brothers and sisters in the Uyghur movement, and I will do whatever I can to help them. But there's a lot of people ahead of me as far as China is concerned.
And then I'll just kind of go through these as quickly as I can, and maybe if you can maybe, just so we can get as many as we can, try and get the answers relatively brief. Chris asked, what are your thoughts on U.S. citizen Paul Whelan, who was recently convicted this week on Russia of espionage charges?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really important question. Paul Whelan is a total innocent. He was an American former veteran from Michigan. He was working in a security company in Michigan, went on vacation to Moscow to attend a friend's wedding and was completely taken on trumped up charges of espionage. And he was sentenced a couple days ago to 16 years of hard labor. And it's the most shocking. They just literally plucked an American tourist out, used him as a hostage. And the purpose of using him as a hostage is to then create a bargaining chip so that the Russians can get some real criminals out of US prisons. And it's just the most upsetting story for him and for his family. And having been a victim of the Russian malice, my heart goes out to them. And I really hope that the US government goes hard and heavy with Magnitsky sanctions against everybody involved in this unbelievable miscarriage of justice.
Do you think his background made him maybe a more viable target for them? The fact that he was, a former Marine, he had then afterwards worked in security for different corporations, different styles, that it would be kind of a plausible level of not to say deniability, but that he was someone who could look, a little more suspect than, say, just a typical tourist.
Yeah, surely. They and when you apply for a visa in Russia, you have to put so much information down that they probably had like 100 targets. And they said, this guy's great. He's got like 4 passports. He was in the military. He's sort of interested in military activities. And I mean, he's friends with soldiers in different countries. Great. Perfect. Trump him up on spy charges. Perfect. The whole story is so implausible. What they're accusing him of is so implausible. And the fact that they convicted him, I mean, basically, if he really was a spy, they would have never arrested him. They don't arrest spies. They kick out spies.
Yeah. And now move to a question, obviously, that this could be an entire presentation, but maybe just quickly give your insights on it. Chip asks, how is it that Russia, with an economy smaller than California, can cause so much trouble in the world?
Well, it's just like it's a good question. And it's not just the economy is so small. They also have a military budget, which is like the same as the UK military budget. I mean, so basically, but you know, it's kind of like a guy in your neighborhood, a crazy guy in your neighborhood carries around a knife and just like wildly swings his knife as he's walking down the street. You know, the knife might not be an automatic weapon, but if nobody's ready to stand up to the guy with the knife, he can cause a lot of trouble. And that's what Putin is doing on a global scale. He just goes and causes trouble, and he does it in these like clever sort of spy type ways. You know, they go into with troops that they take their insignias off their jackets when they go into Crimea. You know, America withdraws from northeast Syria, and all of a sudden they're like, you know, driving their own guys in. You know, it doesn't take a huge military budget or a major economy to do that. He just uses whatever tools he has to his maximum possible advantage.
Karen asked an interesting question. A lot of people might have seen in the news recently about John Bolton's book. It's also somewhere we're looking to host, but I don't know when that will happen now. John Bolton's new book suggests that Putin might have been toying with Trump and that he does not consider the president a formidable foe. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have my own sort of personal experience with Putin and Trump at the Helsinki summit in 2018. That was just happened like the weekend after Robert Mueller indicted 12 Russian military intelligence officers for hacking the US election. And a journalist, after the summit was over, asked Putin, are you going to hand over the 12 GRU officers to Robert Mueller? And Putin said, I'll hand them over if Trump hands over Bill Browder and members of the US intelligence that were supporting his criminal operation. and at the time, Trump said, I think it's a great idea. And it took 4 days for him to walk it back. And it was only when the Senate was about to vote 98-0 not to hand us over that Trump said, you know, I think we're not going to do that. And so there you go.
And just related to that, Mark had asked something right along those lines. What was your reaction when Putin sought Trump's intervention against you in Helsinki in 2018? I mean, were you stunned or what?
Yeah, I was stunned. I mean, I was working on my book, and I was trying not to like look at my phone, and my phone kept on buzzing. And I turned it over, and there was like 92 messages from every person, every journalist I knew, and everybody saying, you know, what do you make of the press conference? And I was like, what press conference? And I turned it on, and I saw him talking about me, and you know, I didn't know what was going to happen. You know, it wasn't pleasant.
And maybe just for the sake of time, we just have two more audience questions, which is great. So Zach asks, at a high level, how would you characterize the current state of the Russian oil industry? Obviously, if anyone who reads the book, you had a huge amount of involvement. I knew a lot of the key players in the energy industry in Russia for a long time. And he says, and specifically, do you believe that Putin and Russia are driven to regain their lost market share from the US in global oil market? Or do you believe there is another angle to their actions?
Well, the main thing about the Russian oil industry is that it's effectively their only industry. I mean, the Russian economy is as a gas station, and it's not an industry that's particularly well run. It's run in the short term. It's run to steal money from the oil companies, and it puts them in a very, very precarious position as a country, because if all the government revenue comes from oil and gas prices are down so dramatically, you know, they're screwed. I mean, they really are in a terrible, terrible situation. It's a total binary bet. If oil prices go up, then they're good. If oil prices stay down, then they're bad. And you know, and then to add insult to injury, you get this sort of weird kind of jailhouse mentality that they have. And then they start fighting with the Saudis, who have the same kind of jailhouse mentality. And then all of a sudden they're like committing, you know, joint suicide and bringing everybody else in the oil business down with them. I think that oil ultimately is going to be their downfall. I'm not I mean, I'm sure we all have our own views on oil, but I kind of see, electric cars and efficiency, all different things happening, which will reduce the amount of oil used. And if you're a country who is solely dependent on oil, that's not a great place to be.
And then someone else asked, how can the evidence collected by Sergei Magnitsky and yourself and others, possibly be used down the line to prosecute Putin, or anyone from his inner circle in the West or beyond? Would that ever happen? Well,
so this is the reason. This is the reason why we did the Magnitsky Act, is because I don't believe that there's any court that's going to prosecute these guys. The International Criminal Court requires 100,000 dead, not one dead. The European Court for Human Rights prosecutes the country, not any individuals. And there are no other legal mechanisms. So the way we're going to get these guys is to get them where it really hurts them, which is their money. They're ready to kill for money. And if that money gets taken away from them, that's how much they value it. And so, again, it's not true justice. We'll get justice eventually at some point in the far future in Russia when the regime finally collapses. But until then, we have to rely on these other tools.
Well, lastly, maybe just give something kind of for everyday people. What would you say to people? Obviously, not everyone can be a powerful force driving the Magnitsky Act in different countries like yourself. But at the end of the day, what would you say to the average American or anyone who might be listening about, accountability, holding your politicians, to account, transparency? What would you say to people who it's not a Democratic issue, it's not a Republican issue, it should be a nonpartisan issue, about what we as a people can do to encourage open and good governance?
Well, I think the most important thing that everyone can do, no matter what your issue is to speak out, to be heard, to don't keep it to yourself. It's the trouble with a lot of people is that they're keeping it to themselves, and you get a lot of dysfunction when people are not ready to be bold and say what's right and what's wrong. And you don't have to be a hero. You don't have to sacrifice everything, but if people were ready, people were willing to say what they think. In my experience, most people in the world are good people. The problems come with just the fact that good people are staying quiet.
It's a great lesson, and obviously so true throughout history, no matter where you look in the world, even within the United States. To basically see something, say something, and take a stand, which you've done, obviously, at great risk to yourself. But again, I want to let the audience know, please join us next week on Thursday, the 25th, with our discussion on Mohammed bin Salman with New York Times Beirut chief Ben Hubbard. And then July 15th, we'll have a discussion with Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And again, Bill, I want to say thank you so much for joining us again. It was wonderful to have you last year in Houston. And at some point, when we all can hopefully travel and get together again, we'd be delighted to have you again in Houston. And most importantly, thank you for the selfless work that you're doing. Really, that has an impact all across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.